Animal Farm by George Orwell. George Orwell was the pen name of Eric Blair, an Englishman born in Bengal, India, and educated at Eton in England. After service with the British colonial Indian Imperial Police in Burma, he returned to Europe to earn his living writing novels and essays. Bitterly opposed to social injustice, political oppression, and verbal cant in every form, he was a socialist who attacked both capitalism and communism, a literary critic who savaged all that he saw as false to life as it was lived and reality as it was, and a novelist who merged his profound political concerns with superbly honed narrative artistry. Besides his classic Animal Farm, his major works include a novel based on his experiences as a colonial policeman, Burmese Days, two first-hand studies of poverty, Down and Out in Paris and London, and The Road to Wigan Pier, an account of his experiences in the Spanish Civil War, Homage to Catalonia, and the extraordinary novel of political prophecy whose title became part of our language, 1984. George Orwell died in 1950 of a neglected lung disease. Animal Farm, a fairy story by George Orwell. Preface by Russell Baker. Introduction by C.M. Woodhouse. Preface by Russell Baker. We were very lucky to get out of Spain alive, George Orwell wrote afterwards. He was not talking about the nearly fatal throat wound he suffered in combat during the Spanish Civil War, but about Stalin's murderous political aparchiks who had gained partial control of the Spanish government by 1937. He had gone to Spain to fight for that government because he thought it represented political decency, and his belief in the importance of political decency had nearly been the end of him. More or less by chance, he had ended up in a Trotskyist outfit at a time when Stalinists were trying to destroy every trace of Trotsky's contribution to the Russian Revolution. These purges were directed from Moscow, but had deadly consequences, even in faraway Spain, where Stalin was ostensibly supporting a democratic Spanish government. Many of our friends were shot, and others spent a long time in prison or simply disappeared, Orwell recalled in his preface to a 1947 Ukrainian-language edition of Animal Farm. This narrow escape from the long reach of Moscow-style politics left him alarmed about the gullibility of other well-meaning, decent people in Western Europe. He thought too many decent people in the Western democracies had succumbed to a dangerously romantic view of the Russian Revolution that blinded them to Soviet reality. Soviet communism paid a heavy price for what it did to Orwell in Spain. Out of that experience came Animal Farm, an attack on the myth of the nobility of Soviet communism. Animal Farm became one of the century's most devastating literary acts of political destruction. Orwell called the book a fairy story. Like Voltaire's Candide, however, with which it bears comparison, it is too many other things to be so handily classified. It is also a political tract, a satire on human folly, a loud hee-haw at all who yearn for utopia, an allegorical lesson, and a pretty good fable in the Aesop tradition. It is also a passionate sermon against the dangers of political innocence. The passage in which the loyal but stupid workhorse boxer is sold to be turned into glue, hides, and bone meal because he is no longer useful is written out of a controlled and icy hatred for the cynicism of the Soviet system, but also out of despair for all deluded people who served it gladly. Maybe because it gilds the philosophical pill with fairy story trappings, Animal Farm has had an astonishing success for a book rooted in politics. Since its first publication at the end of World War II, it has been read by millions. With 1984, published 3 years later, it established Orwell as an important man of letters. It has enriched modern political discourse with the observation that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. How did we ever grasp the true nature of the politics of uplift before Orwell explained it so precisely? George Orwell is the pen name of Eric Blair, the son of a colonial official with long service in British India. Eric was educated as a scholarship boy at Eton and seemed to be miserable there most of the time, largely, one guesses, because of the money gap that divided him from so many of his well-heeled schoolmates. His dislike of the moneyed classes in turn influenced him toward a lifelong loyalty to democratic socialism. After Eton, he went to Burma as a member of the Imperial Constabulary and had the enlightening experience of discovering he was hated by the Burmese people as a symbol of British imperialism. Hating the work himself, he quit and came back to England to try making a living by writing. During the years when he was not very successful, he began to devote himself to work for British socialism. Afterwards, he said he had never written anything good that was not about politics. Before he went to work on Animal Farm, his books were well enough received by the critics but sold modestly. Those old enough to remember the wartime spirit of the 1940s may be startled to realize that Orwell started work on Animal Farm in 1943. As he discovered when he went looking for a publisher, Stalin's Soviet Union was so popular that year in Britain and America that few wanted to hear or read anything critical of it. It was as though a great deal of the West had willingly put on blinders, and this was because the Red Army that year had fought the Nazis to a standstill and forced it to retreat. Suddenly Hitler's army, which had looked invincible for so long, had begun to look vincible. In this period, the air on both sides of the Atlantic was filled with a great deal of justifiable praise for the Soviet people and their fighting forces. Stalin's political system, with its bloody purges and police-state brutality, was an important beneficiary of all this. Looking for a publisher for his small book, Orwell was reminded that British socialists, who idealized the Russian Revolution, had never been hospitable to critics of the Soviet Union. In 1943, however, even conservatives were pro-Soviet. It became hard to write candidly of the Soviet system without being accused of playing dupe to the Nazis. Orwell discovered how hard when he began receiving publishers' rejection on Animal Farm. With its swinish communists, the book seemed heretical, and no wonder. Stalin and Trotsky, after all, were unmistakably Orwell's feuding pigs, Napoleon and Snowball. It was not until the war had ended that Frederick Warburg finally published it on August 17, 1945. It brought Orwell his first popular success, with sales in England vastly exceeding any of his previous books. In America, where it was published in 1946, it sold nearly 600,000 copies in 4 years, and has not stopped selling since. What's curious was Orwell's insistence that he had no intention of damaging the socialist cause. You would never have guessed this after reading the book, but he insisted that he intended only to write a cautionary story for the democratic West, warning it against a dangerously alien form of socialism. Devoted to British socialism, Orwell cannot have found it very pleasant being denounced an enemy of what the Russians, and many of his countrymen too, called socialism. Orwell, of course, was seldom happier than when he was attacking fraud and hypocrisy and hearing the squeals of the injured. Despite his insistence on being political in his work, Orwell's career suggests his politics were the sort that real politicians detest. Why, for example, was Orwell so determined to make the case against Soviet communism at precisely the moment all proper people preferred not to hear it? Devoted socialist he may have been, but he had none of the politician's instinct for trimming sails to the wind when it is expedient to tell people what they want to hear. Worse, he insisted on telling people precisely what they did not want to hear. He was that political figure all politicians fear, the moralist who cannot bear to let any wrong deed go undenounced. As a politician, he had the fatal defect of the totally honest man. He insisted on the truth, even when the truth was most inconvenient. There is an aloneness about Orwell, an insistence on being his own man, on not playing along with the team as the loyal politician is so often expected to do, or else. This is brilliantly illustrated in his classic essay, Politics and the English Language, showing how politicians twist the language to distort and deceive. This amounts to an act of treason within the political trade. The man is trying to make it harder for a politician to fool enough of the people enough of the time to gain power. Orwell seemed more candid than usual about Animal Farm when he wrote the preface for its Ukrainian edition, and it reads very much like an anti-Soviet tract. The communist manhunts in Spain, which he had narrowly escaped, coincided with the Moscow purges, he wrote, and taught me how easily totalitarian propaganda can control the opinion of enlightened people in democratic countries. After seeing innocent people in prison because they were suspected of an unorthodoxy, he was appalled on returning to England to find numerous sensible and well-informed observers believing the most fantastic accounts of conspiracy, treachery, and sabotage alleged in the Moscow purge trials. And so I understood, more clearly than ever, the negative influence of the Soviet myth upon the Western socialist movement. It was of the utmost importance to me that people in Western Europe should see the Soviet regime for what it really was. Since 1930, I had seen little evidence that the USSR was progressing toward anything that one could call true socialism. To the contrary, it was becoming a hierarchical society in which the rulers have no more reason to give up their power than any other ruling class. Since 1937, the year he fled Spain for his life, he had been convinced that the destruction of the Soviet myth was essential if we wanted a revival of the socialist movement. Here he was conceding that Animal Farm was meant to help destroy the Soviet myth. In the late 1940s, several books were published that heavily influenced intellectual attitudes about the future of totalitarianism. All were bleak, written, it seemed, from a deep conviction that the totalitarian state would develop such formidable powers in the future that humans would become helpless to preserve their identity. Orwell, with Animal Farm and 1984, and Arthur Koestler, with Darkness at Noon, were read on campuses everywhere and so spread a mood of pessimism, which was probably responsible for a great deal of the intellectual community's enthusiasm for the Cold War. Aldous Huxley's utopian Brave New World, with its portrait of a heavily drugged society easily manipulated by politicians, also had considerable vogue in this era. What all had in common was a depressing pessimism about the future. Like so much other writing of the era, they rested on the assumption that individuals were no match for the efficient new technology at the disposal of totalitarian politicians. Rubashov in Darkness at Noon is as powerless against the inhumane force of new Soviet man Gletkin as Winston Smith in 1984 is powerless to prevail over the incredible police efficiency of Big Brother. In the future worlds envisioned in this literature, inhumanity has triumphed over mankind's pathetic little attempts to stand up against totalitarian efficiency. Animal Farm ends on a slightly less hopeless note, but only slightly. Well, here we are in that future that so many writers 50 years ago could only guess at, and what do we see? They were ludicrously wrong about the amazing efficiency with which totalitarians would destroy individualism. Why did they get it all wrong? For one thing, they were men who had come to maturity in the age of the dictators. Hitler had terrified their generation with a glimpse of what inhuman tyrants could do with the modern technology at the state's disposal. The war with Hitler had been a close thing, one perhaps only because Hitler himself had conducted it with such human stupidity. The pessimists failed to allow for the stupidity and incompetence factor among people who had run the totalitarian states. There was little cause for joy in the result of the Hitler War, a vast increase in Stalin's dictatorial power. The fantastic new technology seemed to provide the malevolent state with devices that would make it easy to enslave the individual. In 1984, television makes it possible for Big Brother to watch everybody all the time. Huxley's Brave New World hints at the power of drugs to keep people permanently pacified. What was unpredictable was the liberating effect of technology. The Soviet Union could surround itself with walls, but could not block out revolutionary radio and electronic waves, which stirred up the supposedly whipped human herd with an irresistible appetite for rock and roll, blue jeans, and other such subverters of totalitarian rule. Finally, the fearful efficiency of the totalitarian state turned out to be an absurd myth. As someone finally pointed out, making a simple telephone call in Moscow could sometimes take hours, if not days. None of this is to say that Orwell and his fellow pessimists of the 1940s ought not to be read with great respect. They should be. They show us the edge of terror on which we lived 50 years ago, and help us understand why that generation was willing to spend so much treasure and take such daring risks to keep totalitarianism at bay. And in Animal Farm, Orwell left us a lesson about the human contribution to political terror that will always be as up to date as next year's election.